Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of back up a little bit and then go forward. So I just want to reiterate the Battle of Yorktown and just kind of go through this with you so we're on the same page and to help Ivan out a little bit set the stage. So we told you that in 1781, the American Army has really reversed the Redcoats' momentum in the South, because what happened is Nathaniel Greene won a decisive battle at Guilford Courthouse. He got General Cornwallis and his men too far away from supply lines, and British General Cornwallis and his army had to march north into Virginia to kind of get regrouped after that loss. So for the first time in many, many years in the American Revolution, General Washington and the Continental Army really have the British on the run for the first time. So Washington now needs what he thinks is a knockout punch, because he's got to enlist the help of the French. The French have given us 6,000 men and some supplies for this effort, but they're not willing to really contribute too much more because they're not sure if we're going to win or not. So Washington needs a knockout punch, and he is going to try to get that knockout punch to keep the French in the helping mode. Okay, now we talked about that Washington needed a military grand slam to continue French aid and save the revolution for the Americans. And a Virginia slave by the name of James Armistead is going to help, in baseball terms, General Washington load the bases. So we mentioned that most slaves in the colonies had sided with the British because the British had promised they would be free if they won the war, whereas America, obviously, by looking at our history, didn't promise anything of the sort. So as a result of that, James Armistead was considered by General Cornwallis as a loyal British servant. He basically served Cornwallis, and he won the trust of all the other British officers as well. Well, Armistead is actually a Patriot spy, and he's one of several slaves that have been recruited for the American side. And so General Washington, what he really needed to know at this point is which direction General Cornwallis and his troops were going to head once they regrouped in Virginia. And as the British march into Virginia, Armistead's carefully listening, and he's passing on valuable information he's getting from Cornwallis and his other officers, and he's passing that information on to other black slaves who are serving as spies. And those black slaves that are serving as spies are reporting the information that Armistead is giving them to 23-year-old French commander Marquis de Lafayette. And the reason Lafayette is getting the information rather than Washington is because Washington has assigned Lafayette and some American forces to basically shadow Cornwallis's army in Virginia to see, once they regroup, which way they are going. So this is kind of where we ended yesterday. And in August of 1781, James Armistead uncovers a secret that has the potential to change the course of the war in favor of the colonists. In August of 1781, Armistead uncovers a secret that has the potential to change the course of the war in favor of the colonists. Now, what did the British need? What did Cornwallis need after this whole story I told you? What's he short on? Supplies, right? So Cornwallis has got a plan that they were looking for a deep water port that would accommodate the British fleet, who would bring supplies from New York Harbor down into Virginia. But they had to find a deep water port that would accommodate those big ships. In other words, they're not going to, sail into the Bighorn River here because it's not deep enough. So Armistead is listening to Cornwallis and his officers, and they're talking about trying to find a deep water port near where they are located so that the British fleet can come from New York Harbor southward and bring them needed supplies. Does that make sense? Now, as Cornwallis studies what would be the best deep water port, where does he find that would be? In Yorktown, right. Yorktown is a port town. And Cornwallis discovers that the best deep water port that he could direct that British fleet into with those supplies would be in the port town of Yorktown, Virginia. It's going to provide the best deep water for the British fleet. So, Armistead hears this, right? So who does he tell this information to? The other slave spies, and Lafayette receives this information through Armistead from those other slave spies. Well, once he gets that information, he's got to relay that directly to who? George Washington. That's what he does. Because George Washington is presently stationed north of Virginia in New York. Okay, that's where his army is. Because was his army fighting in the South? No, Nathaniel Greene's was, and mainly militia, right? So when Lafayette received the information that Yorktown was the spot that Cornwallis was going to get the British fleet to come into with these supplies, he immediately sent word to General Washington, who had the Continental Army in New York. Now this is kind of interesting because just by coincidence, 28 French ships were heading to America to provide assistance. And ironically, guess where they were going to port? Yorktown. So it was just by coincidence that we already had 28 French ships that were bringing us men and supplies, right? That were coming from France, and their plan to meet General Washington and Lafayette were also to port at Yorktown, okay? Now, with this new information, Washington's going to prepare a plan to set the perfect trap for Cornwallis and the British soldiers. Because Washington knows, because of correspondence, that the French fleet is scheduled to get to Yorktown before the British fleet is. Okay? He already knows that's going to happen because of his correspondence. So the French Navy is scheduled to arrive at Yorktown before the British fleet comes south from New York Harbor. Now you'll see this on the video, but why is that crucial? Because if the French Navy gets to Yorktown in that harbor before the British, it would block Cornwallis's escape, right? If he stays put. Okay, if he chooses to move somewhere else, is that going to work? Now you got to look at, here's Virginia, and here's your area of Yorktown, okay? So he's going to want this fleet to get in behind so that he cannot escape. But it only works if Cornwallis stays put where he's regrouping his men, okay? And if he stays put, Washington is going to march his men south from New York into Virginia and trap Cornwallis and his soldiers with no escape. That's the plan. But Cornwallis will have to stay put. And if this plan works out where he can get the French fleet up there behind him at Yorktown and not cause an area for them to escape inland, right, then they can maybe win the Revolutionary War right here. Now, Washington figured that a victory at Yorktown for the Americans would defeat half of the British forces in America in one battle. They were all there. They were regrouping, okay? So half of the British forces in America are at Yorktown. And so that's why it's really important that Washington try to find a way to have Cornwallis and his troops stay put. Because if they march out, it ruins his plan. Does that make sense? Now, Cornwallis has got his spies out there. And who's he spying on? Not so much Washington, but Lafayette. And Cornwallis has gotten the word that Lafayette's American troops are shadowing them. And so he decides that he wants to attack away from Yorktown, which means that he would be moving out of the trap. Now at this point, the British have 8,000 men at Yorktown compared to the 3,200 men that who has? Not Greene. Lafayette. Okay? So 8,000 to 3,200 in the area. Now, the only way that this plan that Washington has is if he can convince Cornwallis to stay in Yorktown. Now, the reason he wants to fight away from Yorktown is he doesn't feel threatened. He wants to get away from where the British are coming in because he doesn't want any problems in that area when these British ships come down. So if he's confident of victory, he was going to move away from Yorktown to fight. If he would not be confident in victory, he would stay in Yorktown for protection. Does that make sense? So, how in the world are we going to get Cornwallis to stay where he is when he's so confident that his 8,000 men will defeat the 3,200 Patriots? Well, this is where James Armistead comes in again. Okay? This is where he comes in again. This is crucial. Now, ironically, guess what Cornwallis assigned Armistead to do? He's normally just serving him. But he goes up and he says, hey, here's what I want you to do. What's he want him to do, Lauren? Because he's concerned about Lafayette's men because he wants to engage him outside of Yorktown. So what does he do with Armistead? Tells him to go spy on Lafayette. Okay? So ironically, General Cornwallis has assigned James Armistead to serve as a spy on Lafayette's men and report back. Go see how many he has. Go make sure he's only got 3,200. Make sure that, you feel that we can defeat them in battle away from Yorktown. So Armistead says, okay. Well, obviously he travels to Lafayette's position and spies on him after talking to Lafayette, and he brings back this information to Cornwallis. And when Armistead travels to Lafayette's position and visits with Lafayette about what's going on, he brings back the following information to General Cornwallis. He comes back and tells General Cornwallis that Commander Lafayette actually has well over 6,000 soldiers with him. Does Cornwallis have any reason not to trust Armistead? No, none at all. Been a loyal servant. So he takes that information as truthful, and he decides to stand fast at Yorktown because he's not sure he wants to engage 6,000 Patriots with his forces. That's a lot different than 3,200. Okay? So he decides to stand fast because he wants to wait to get more arms and supplies from these British ships in the New York Harbor. Then what's he going to do? Then he's going to get after them. Okay? But he stands fast. Well, in the meantime, once this information is relayed, what's Washington doing in September of 1781? What's he doing? Because his plan's working, so what's he doing? What's that? He's got them all together now. He's been waiting. So what's he doing? He's moving southward to Yorktown because he knows that this French fleet is going to beat the British fleet there, and he's going to try to trap Cornwallis and engage him in a battle. So in September of 1781, General Washington's ground forces arrive outside of Yorktown, and about the same time, the French Navy has also arrived, and they've blocked any escape route for the British by sea. So you got Washington by land, the French fleet by sea. They got him surrounded, so to speak. Okay? Well, by the time Washington gets his men down there, and Greene has his men in the area, and Lafayette has his men in the area, the British are outnumbered 2-1 in Yorktown. 2-1. Now this was quite a battle. We've talked about battles that lasted a couple, 3 days. This battle at Yorktown lasted 3 full weeks. 3 weeks of fighting. And after 3 weeks of fighting, Britain's mighty army had been brought to their knees. So after 3 weeks of fighting around Yorktown, Great Britain's mighty army had been brought to their knees by the colonists. So, on October 19th, 1781, what did General Charles Cornwallis do? Surrendered to General Washington. October 19th, 1781. Now, news of Cornwallis's surrender shocked the British back in England, especially their Prime Minister. The first person that can tell me who the Prime Minister of Britain is right now, I'll give 5 points extra credit. First person that can tell me who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain that is absolutely shocked at this news of the events at Yorktown. If I was you, I'd be rifling. Well, I'm sure you did somewhere. So I'm going to give us 2 minutes to hear the first person tell me who the Prime Minister of Great Britain is at this time during the defeat of the British at Yorktown. Go ahead, don't be bashful, it's the first one. Wait, well, we've already talked about him, it's not a new person. What? You're on the right track. No? No? Lord Frederick North.
Harris, you don't need it. Shut up, King. I got it.
Yeah, she doesn't need it, but you know what? That girl is competitive. I love that about her. She's a competitor. Yes, so the news of Cornwallis's surrender shocks the British back in England, especially Prime Minister Sir Frederick North. And basically, this American victory at Yorktown sends the British government 3 clear messages. Okay? This American victory at Yorktown is going to send the British government 3 clear messages. First thing that Sir Frederick North figured out pretty quick is that the war in America was not even close to being over in their favor, right? Matter of fact, it's close to being over in the colonists' favor. So he finds out that the war in America was certainly not being close to being over and not in favor of the British. What might be the second thing that Sir Frederick North realizes if the British are going to win? What's he going to have to do? Very good, Hunter. He's going to have to send a whole new army. Is that cheap? Very expensive. So it made it real clear to Sir Frederick North that in order to keep fighting this war with hope of victory over the colonists, he's going to have to send a whole new army to America at a considerable cost to his country. And then you got to weigh, is this worth it or not? Right? And the third thing he figured out pretty quickly is that his own British soldiers' morale was not there. The victory at Yorktown killed the British morale to continue the Revolutionary War. And in essence, this victory at Yorktown ends the Revolutionary War unofficially. Okay? But it's just like other wars we fought, including the Civil War and the war in Vietnam, for example, is just because everybody says it's time to quit, not everybody gets the word, right? And so despite this British loss at Yorktown, which really resulted in the end of the Revolutionary War unofficially in favor of the Americans, fighting actually continued for almost another full year. Because British redcoats and local patriot militia would fight until the British army that was still in America was what? Called back home. Didn't think it was over. So all these British soldiers that are captured, the ones that survived, are going to have to make the decision, the Prime Minister is, on whether they're going to send them back home or not. Well, nobody quit fighting, including British redcoats and militia, who fought until the British army went back. Okay? Now, anybody want to guess where most of this was fought? Not so much north, not so much south, kind of in the middle. Where they continue. So that'll take us to the Revolutionary War's final battle. And I'm going to introduce you to a little 16-year-old girl by the name of Betty Zane. Betty Zane. So the Revolutionary War's final battle. The last battle of the Revolutionary War began on September 11th, 1782. The very last battle of the Revolutionary War began on September 11th, 1782, and it occurred at Fort Henry, Virginia. Fort Henry, Virginia. So the last battle of the Revolutionary War began on September 11th, 1782 at Fort Henry, Virginia. And it wasn't by any means any kind of a major battle. It just happened to be the last skirmish, okay? In this battle at Fort Henry, Virginia, there were approximately 100 patriots that were trapped inside Fort Henry. And they were surrounded by 50 redcoats and about 250 Indians that were loyal to the crown. So at this last battle of the Revolutionary War, you had approximately 100 patriots that were trapped inside Fort Henry in Virginia, and the fort was surrounded by about 50 redcoats and approximately 250 Indians that were loyal, loyal to the crown. Now this thing went on for like 2 days. These 100 patriots had held off these 50 redcoats and 250 Indians for 2 days, but they were struggling because they were running short of what? What? What specifically? What specifically? Gunpowder. Very good, gunpowder. So you couldn't fire your weapons very well at the time, you had to have gunpowder. So after holding off the enemy for 2 days, these 100 patriots inside Fort Henry were running short on gunpowder. As a matter of fact, they only had one final keg of gunpowder to help them get through this thing and ward off the attack and survive. The trouble was, that doggone powder keg